Nuclear physics is our topic today on Creation Magazine Live.
We'll be sitting down with Dr. Jim Mason, whose PhD is in experimental nuclear physics. You won't want to miss it.
Welcome to Creation Magazine Live. I'm Richard Fangrad.
And I'm Calvin Smith, and we're pleased today to have a special guest, Dr. Jim Mason. Jim,
Yes.
Thanks very much for joining us on the show.
My pleasure,
Jim.
Calvin.
Yeah.
All right, so here's a physics-related news item. Just recently it was announced that Peter Higgs and Francois Englert were jointly awarded the 2013 Nobel Prize in Physics. Now this was for, to quote the Nobel website, this was for the theoretical discovery of a mechanism that contributes to our understanding of the origin of mass of subatomic particles, and which recently was confirmed through the discovery of the predicted fundamental particle by the ATLAS and CMS experiments at CERN's Large Hadron Collider. Now there's a mouthful.
This mechanism, as it's referred to in the announcement, generally known as the Higgs boson, right? That's the God particle. Given this nickname, what should Christians make of this discovery? Does this discovery have anything to do with proving or disproving God, or what should we take away from this?
In no way, and I'll explain that in a bit. But first, to me, the Higgs boson actually provides a pretty clear demonstration of the quite incredible design intelligence there is behind the universe. That is, in fact, the creator God of the Bible. But to explain that, we need to understand a little bit more about what the Higgs boson is and where it fits in our understanding of what matter is and how it works.
Right.
But I think first I'd like to comment on that nickname that it has, the God particle.
Right.
That actually came about when a popular science writer was writing in a magazine and referred to it as the God expletive deleted particle, because it had turned out to be so difficult to find. The people at the magazine thought that was probably an inappropriate way to express it, so they actually did delete the expletive, and it became known as the God particle. Since that time, it's kind of taken on an almost religious connotation, that it's considered to be somehow, a superior particle with almost supernatural characters. But it's not. It's just a particle. In fact, it's one of 17 particles that comprise what's referred to in particle physics as the Standard Model.
Okay.
And to understand what the Standard Model is, it consists of three types of particles. They're called quarks, which people may have heard from and may remember the CBC program, Perks and Quarks, leptons, and gauge bosons, of which obviously the Higgs boson is the most recent. The bosons, of which there are now 5, are the particles which give us the 4 fundamental forces that we have in the universe. And those are the strong nuclear force, the weak nuclear force, the force of gravity, and the electromagnetic force.
Okay.
Prior to the experimental confirmation of the Higgs boson, probably the best known boson was the photon, which is the particle that's associated with the electromagnetic force. Photons are the things, in effect, that allow you to see light and which make digital cameras work. The other gauge bosons are gluons, which are associated with the strong nuclear force, and that's a real name. That's what the scientists call it, the gluon.
It's weird names.
I just didn't make that up.
Yeah.
And W and Z bosons, which are responsible for the weak nuclear force. So with photons, gluons, W and Z bosons, we have a theoretical explanation of three of the 4 forces in the universe. And the thing that was missing was a theoretical explanation of gravity. And that's because there wasn't a good theoretical explanation for the property of mass. And mass, of course, is kind of critical to the force of gravity.
Sure,
and that's where the Higgs boson comes in, because it was the theoretical particle associated with defining mass for all the other particles. Now, to understand how a particle can create mass for other particles, consider this analogy. You've got an auditorium full of people who are movie fans, and so the people you can consider to be the individual bosons.
Okay.
And this room full of people is the field associated with those bosons. And so you get some well-known movie star comes in one door of the auditorium and wants to cross over the auditorium and go out of the other door. He's going to have a difficult time.
Right.
Right, because people are going to want to get his autograph and talk to him about this and shake his hand and all of that sort of thing. So he's got a heavy mass. He's a heavyweight actor.
All right, yeah, makes sense.
So if you got somebody who isn't a movie star who comes in and wants to do the same thing, they can walk across quite unimpeded because they're a lightweight. Okay, so that's how a particle in a field can create a property. So that's the direct significance of the boson then. It provides a theoretical basis for mass, which in turn provides the basis for explaining gravity. So, but to understand how this shows the design intelligence behind the universe, we need to know a little bit about the quirks and the quarks. Or the quarks and the leptons. There are 6 of each. 4 of them are highly unstable. So although we can create them in the lab by banging other things together, they tend to disintegrate pretty quickly and transform back into the 2 that are stable. The 2 quarks that are stable are the things that make up protons and neutrons, which people are probably familiar with.
Yes.
One of the leptons that's stable is the electron, which is the other thing that people are probably familiar with. The other stable lepton is something called a neutrino, which is, people probably don't know about it because it doesn't interact with matter very much. Now, turns out all the matter that we can see in the universe is composed of neutrons, protons, and electrons. And all of the forces are comprised of these 5 bosons. So here we have everything in the universe that we can see in a physical sense is made out of just 3 particles.
Wow. Cool.
They're just designed in such a way that they can go together to make all of the elements that we know, with the resulting features in the elements that they can go together to make all of the compounds that we know, put the compounds together to make all kinds of stuff like this and you and me.
Right.
So God has designed these 3 fundamental particles so that everything in the universe can be constructed of it. If you think of somebody trying to design a car, for example, there are lots of different parts in a car. So be able to design something so that you can make everything with only 3 distinct parts seems to me to be an incredible bit of intelligent design.
That's amazing, yeah. Let's talk more about this in 60 seconds.
In 2001, a fossil skull found in Chad electrified the world's scientific community. Nicknamed Tumai, this creature supposedly lived when the human and chimp lineages allegedly split, making it the oldest human ancestor ever found. The leader of the team that made the discovery confessed, "It's a lot of emotion to have in my hand the beginning of the human lineage. I have been looking for this for so long. I knew I would one day find it, so it's a large part of my life." But not all scientists accept this conclusion. For instance, Dr. Bridget Sennett of the Natural History Museum in Paris dismissed the skull as a mere female gorilla. With such conflicting opinions about the same skull, it does make you wonder. Perhaps the skull's discoverer let his emotion and desire for discovery obscure his interpretation of the evidence.
To find out more from Creation Ministries International, visit our website, creation.com.
If you just tuned in, we're talking with Dr. Jim Mason, a physicist, about physics and the creation-evolution issue. That's what we're talking about today on Creation Magazine Live.
That's right. I mean, Jim, it's great to have you here. You know, many times creationists are kind of chided. Well, no real scientist, believes what the Bible says, that the Bible teaches, a young earth, a 6-day creation. How could you possibly believe in Genesis? I mean, you've got your PhD in experimental nuclear physics. You're talking about radioisotope dating, all these kind of things you must have interacted with. How do you answer people when they ask you things like that and say, well, how can you then, with what we're commonly being taught, how does that fit with what the Bible says about a young earth and a recent creation?
Good question, Cal. I think the evidence from other branches of science like geology and paleontology and biology and genetics are all pretty clear. They're all exactly what you would expect from the biblical account of creation.
They are, yes.
But in the age of the Earth issue, especially with respect to radiometric dating, that doesn't seem to be the case. And that actually gave me a lot of trouble initially with this whole concept.
As a physicist, yeah.
As
I
a
can imagine.
physicist,
And
yeah.
a Christian.
However, radiometric dating isn't all that it seems to be when you look at it in some considerable detail. For example, using a technique that is intended to measure the age of a rock from when a molten rock from when it gets hard, we get wildly incorrect answers. For example, the lava that was formed during the eruption of Mount St. Helens, which was in 1980,
Right.
they get measurements all the way up to 2.8 million years for the age of that rock since it became hard, using that technique.
It should
Those rocks are only about 30, 35 years old.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so this gets traced back to one of the assumptions, and the assumption in that particular one is that there is no of the resulting product, the radioactive decay product, in the rock when it became hard, because it was hot beforehand. So they've developed other techniques that are supposed to account for that, but when these techniques are used to measure rocks, they get wildly different ages, and they should all agree.
Okay.
So it seems pretty clear from looking at the results of these things that there's something amiss, and you can trace it back to the assumptions that go into the calculations. The calculations themselves are pretty straightforward, but they all make certain assumptions, like the one about there being no end product in the rock to start with. And if you look at those assumptions, they're assumptions about the history of the rock. And since no one's been around to actually observe and record that history,
Right.
you can't know whether any of those assumptions are actually true. There are assumptions about the amount of radioactive element and resultant stable element that are present initially. There are assumptions about whether or not, or it's assumption about a closed system that assumes that nothing's been added to or removed from the sample during its entire existence.
Right.
And you just can't know whether that's the case.
Yeah,
And there's
those are-
certainly
those
lots
are-
of geological processes that could make those things incorrect.
So the unreasonable assumptions that no one can know lead to the inaccuracies in that particular dating method.
That seems to be the case,
Yeah.
certainly. When you look at the results, they're just all over the place. And when you know what the right answer is, you seem to always get the wrong answer.
Wow.
So when you don't know what the right answer is, how do you know that the answer you've gotten is right?
So you're a physicist, and yet when we talk about radioisotope dating, the physics involved in that, here's a physicist who doesn't believe that this particular dating method indicates that the Earth is old. So we'll be back with more shortly.
Refuting Evolution is a powerful, concise summary that explains where the common evidences used to promote evolution in textbooks are wrong, while at the same time showing how creation is better supported by scientific observations. It will stimulate much discussion and help students and teachers think more critically about the creation-evolution debate, particularly the often overlooked differences between operational and historical science and how they relate to the topic of origins. Order your copy today at creation.com.
Welcome back. This week we're talking to Jim Mason, and we're just talking about radioisotope decay rates and these assumptions that are made, unproven assumptions where, I mean, the average layperson, when they hear an expert quote, well, this rock here, this is 35 million years old. They often just go, oh, well, they must know what they're talking about, and don't really understand those assumptions.
Yeah.
So just elaborate on that a little more for us.
Sure. Many of the assumptions, as we indicated, are about the history of the rock and cannot be verified. One of them, which is that the transformation from the radioactive element to the stable element has always been the same as it is today, has been constant, has recently been shown by several experiments to actually not be true.
Yes.
In the short term, right here and now today. They've looked in various universities have looked at decay rates of well-known radioactive substances. Cobalt-60 was one of them. It was one I used when I was doing my research. And they found that rate, the rate at which that decays, varies on an annual basis. It seems to be somehow related to the distance between the Earth and the Sun, or maybe the rotation of the Sun or something. They don't actually know.
So many people were taught that certain radioisotopes decay at a certain rate. We've measured them, and so if we start here and we've only got this, there's this much difference, we can calculate that and we can determine the age of something. That's just the way people have it in their head, right?
Yes, that's correct. That's the assumption is that it's always been the same, so
Right.
that we can use that in the equation and get an age.
Right.
But that's now been shown not to be the case.
I guess that's like a clock that would run at different speeds, right? How would you ever use it to tell time if the clock
That's right.
is constantly
That's right.
faster, slower, that kind of thing? So that's the problem with this particular dating method.
Pretty much,
One of
yes,
the problems.
that's it.
That's great.
That's
What about carbon dating? People often say carbon dating, of course, has nothing to do with millions of years. It's a little different type of dating method than the ones that do give those vast ages. What do we know about carbon dating? Why doesn't it work either?
Well, again, it's based on a number of assumptions. A fundamental assumption in carbon dating is that carbon dating is used for material which is originally of organic nature because it's sort of made
Once
from
alive.
Right. It's made initially in the photosynthesis of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere into plant material, and then animals consume the plant material and incorporate the radioactive carbon into their biological tissue and so on. And as they are alive and doing that, it reaches some kind of equilibrium. But when they stop, then they're not replenishing it, and the radiocarbon starts to decay away. And by measuring the ratio of the radiocarbon to the normal carbon in the sample at any particular time, you can then theoretically calculate how long that's been going on.
Right.
But it's based on the assumption that when that plant material was growing, the ratio of carbon-14 to normal carbon, carbon-12 in the atmosphere, is the same as it is today.
Right.
Okay.
And if that's incorrect, then the calculated age is incorrect.
Well, that
And-
seems like a reasonable assumption. Are there
Well,
suggestions that it's not?
I would submit from the biblical perspective, there's a great deal of suggestion that there's not. To start
Okay.
with, we don't know because the Bible doesn't tell us, but carbon-14 is not essential for life. Carbon-12 is, but not carbon-12, or carbon-14, so it's reasonable to assume that God didn't make any. So then it would have to build up in the atmosphere. So during the 1,500 years that the vegetation was growing prior to the flood, that vegetation that essentially got buried and turned into coal,
Yes.
there would be a lower amount of carbon-14 in the atmosphere. There'd probably also be a higher amount of carbon-12 in the atmosphere because there was a huge amount of vegetation buried, and that all needs carbon dioxide in the atmosphere to sustain it. And that carbon dioxide would be made pretty much all from carbon-12.
Okay.
So the ratio was quite different before the flood, quite a bit smaller than it is today, and therefore the age would be quite a bit less.
So if we take the biblical history into account, it makes sense of the data that we're seeing in science.
Yes, scientists, some creation scientists got some coal samples from the U.S. Bureau of Mines and actually sent them away for radiometric dating. Now these coal samples should have been between 38 million and 318 million years old. And the instruments that are used to measure carbon-14 can only measure down to a level that corresponds to an age of about 90,000.
Right.
So anything that's older than 90,000 would not have enough radiocarbon to be detected. These samples all came back with very large amounts of radiocarbon, and all about the same, regardless of the alleged
Wow.
age of the coal.
So they're supposed to be in a time scale of, right, that's much, much shorter than the millions of years.
Yes.
But so that doesn't
And
make sense.
they all had more or less the same age, which is exactly what you would expect if all of this coal resulted from vegetation that was buried during the flood and grew before the flood.
With a lower ratio of 14,
With a lower ratio of
C14
carbon-14 to
C12.
carbon-12,
Yeah.
exactly right.
Fascinating stuff. We'll be back with more.
Many claim that our eyes' retinas are wired backwards. Thus, they say, our eyes could not have been specially designed because an intelligent creator would have wired them correctly. But this claim doesn't make sense. After all, octopus retinas are wired in the supposedly correct way, but their sight is poor compared to ours. Ophthalmologist Dr. Peter Gurney has shown that there are good reasons our retinas are wired the way they are. In particular, it allows the photoreceptors to be in close contact with two special tissues behind the retina that are necessary for regenerating the photoreceptors and absorbing excess heat. But these tissues are both opaque, so if our retinas were wired the other way, you'd be trying to look through two opaque surfaces, which would mean you'd see nothing. And then the eagles have the same wiring as us, and they are renowned for their eagle eyes. Maybe the Creator got it right after all.
To find out more from Creation Ministries International, visit our website, creation.com.
Welcome back. We're talking about nuclear physics and radioisotope dating and nuclear decay rates with a nuclear physicist, Dr. Jim Mason. So glad to have you on the program today.
Good to
now,
be here.
There was a creationist sort of a task force that was set up a number of years ago now to study specifically radioisotope dating. and some groundbreaking research there that the rate, guys, the radioisotopes and the age of the Earth, RATE. What is the RATE program, and what's some of the groundbreaking research that they were involved in?
Well, as you mentioned, the RATE program was a group of creation scientists who got together to look at this issue of radioisotope decay and what it implied for the age of the Earth. And one of the experiments they did, one of the results that they found was the stuff we mentioned about carbon-14.
Right.
Right. So that was pretty interesting. Another very interesting work was some that they did on some little wee tiny crystals called zircon crystals, which tend to accumulate uranium when they're formed, and uranium decays into lead. And when they looked at the ratio of lead to uranium in these crystals and did the normal calculations for radiometric dating, it gave an age of 1.5 billion years for these zircon crystals,
Okay,
which
wow.
incidentally
Old,
were
yeah.
dug out of very deep in the earth by Los Alamos National Laboratory and given to these guys to do the work.
Yeah.
But what they also noticed was that there was an awful lot of helium in these crystals. Now, when uranium decays to lead, it produces, for each uranium atom that decays, 8 effectively helium nuclei, which then get electrons and turn into helium.
Okay.
And helium is, if you like, a slippery gas. It's very small, it's noble, it doesn't make any compounds, so it leaks out of everything. Leaks out of helium balloons, in fact.
Right.
So if these zircon crystals have been 1.5 billion years old, they should have had essentially no helium left in them. And they had amounts of helium that would correspond to about 58% of the helium that would have been produced by a result of the indicated decay.
Okay, so if they're very, very old, you just said that there shouldn't be a lot of helium there.
Correct.
That's because in 1.5 billion years, there would have been plenty of time for the helium to decay, to
leak
migrate
out.
away,
Yes,
to leak
leak
out,
out,
as
to
you said.
diffuse, what they say called diffuse out of the
But what did they
zircon.
find?
Well, what they did before they found anything was they did some calculations of the rate at which helium would diffuse through zircon if, in fact, the zircon crystals were 1.5 billion years old.
Right.
And another set of calculations based on what it would be if they were only 6,000 years old.
Ah.
And the difference was pretty large, like it was a factor of 100,000, so it's
yeah.
not even close.
Right.
And then they got some other zircon crystals from the same borehole and sent them away to a lab to have this diffusion rate measured, and the results came back exactly corresponding to the prediction based on a 6,000-year-old Earth.
Wow.
So it's pretty good indication from radiometric dating, if you like, for a 6,000-year-old Earth, based not on assumptions about original content or anything like that,
Right.
but about how fast helium diffuses through zircon, completely unrelated.
Yeah.
And
the difference is you can actually measure.
That's right.
Instead of the helium diffusion rates, right?
Right.
And instead of just having that as a bald assumption, we can measure that today.
That's correct.
very interesting.
And one of the corollaries of that is that because of the amount of lead that was present, it's a pretty clear indication that there was indeed a period of accelerated nuclear decay in the past, so that this assumption about the decay rate being constant over time is probably not correct, as has been demonstrated by recent experiments.
Incredible.
So it kind of all comes together.
Science shows that accelerated nuclear decay was a very real possibility, and that fits wonderfully with the Bible, and it means that the rocks that are measured via this method are all artificially older.
Correct. Absolutely
Fascinating
right.
stuff. We'll be back shortly.
Creation Ministries International edifies the body of Christ by providing more than 30 years of Bible-supporting scientific research, delivered through speaking engagements, books, magazines, and a variety of media, much of which is archived on our website, creation.com. Did you know that if you read 3 articles on creation.com each day, it would take over 7 years to read them all? Such a wealth of information didn't arise by chance, however. We do this through the faithful prayers and gifts of our supporters, which also fund ongoing research. Support the building up of the church by partnering with CMI. Donate today at creation.com/donate.
Welcome back. Today we're talking with Dr. Jim Mason. And now we've been talking about radioisotope dating and how that didn't seem to fit with biblical history. But at the first of the show, you made quite a bold statement when you said, well, the evidence from biology, genetics, geology, and even paleontology seem to, fit exactly what you'd expect from what the Bible says. Now, that's probably a very shocking statement to many people. They would say, well, really? I thought all the evidence pointed to evolution.
And coming from a scientist.
Coming
too,
from a
right?
scientist, yeah. So could you explain what you mean by it? Give us some of the evidence that you feel is just so blatantly obvious.
Right, I'll try. I'm going to start with biology, and here I'd like to quote a Nobel laureate, Dr. Jacques Monod, and I'm going to read this to make sure I get it right. He said, "But the major problem is the origin of the genetic code and its translation mechanisms. The code is meaningless unless translated. The modern cell's translating machinery consists of at least 50 macromolecular components which are themselves coded in DNA. The code cannot be translated otherwise than by products of translation. When and how did this circle become closed? It is exceedingly difficult to imagine." In other words, the instructions for making proteins that are encoded in the DNA can't be decoded unless you've already made some proteins using those machines to make the proteins.
It's the chicken and egg problem.
Precisely.
Or the CD and the CD player. If you have instructions for how to make a CD player on the CD.
How do you make the seed? Exactly, exactly. Now, it is indeed difficult for evolutionists to imagine how that came about, because it can't come about by slow and gradual processes, but it's perfectly in agreement with what's in the Bible. And then in genetics, what we've learned about multi-level codes is that they can't come into existence spontaneously. They have to be created by something.
Right.
And yet we have this incredibly complex code in the DNA that we don't really understand yet. It's many layers, and people, they say that happened by accident. Now, on the other hand, we have the SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence scientists who are listening to radiation from the cosmos, because they say if they see a code, it'll be an indication of an intelligence behind the code.
Right.
And so on the one hand, they say if you see a code, it indicates intelligence behind it. And on the other hand, you've got all this complex code in the DNA. Well, that just happened by accident.
Right.
I mean, come on.
Yeah, you're actually they're contradicting themselves in their own worldview, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
Okay. Well, there's two great evidences. What else?
And in genetics again, the geneticists tell us that by looking at mitochondrial DNA, which is inherited through the female line, that we have all descended from one woman.
Imagine that.
With 3 sublines. And by looking at the Y chromosomal DNA, it says we've all descended from one man. Now that's exactly what you would expect from the biblical account of creation.
Exactly.
With the bottleneck of the flood, reducing it to the 3 daughter-in-laws of Noah.
Right. Right.
What else could there be?
I guess it's just the fact that many people have just never been exposed to the arguments. I guess that CMI, Creation Ministries, is known for, right, on the website and things like that.
The website is excellent. Yes, it has all this stuff available on the website, and it's just a great source of information.
Right.
Tremendous.
And even the rate material. I mean, if you're watching, you can go to creation.com, type in rate, or get the rate book there, the thousands, not billions. Just a brilliant summary of that research.
It is.
Yeah.
Fascinating stuff. So, yeah, creation.com. That's where you want to go to get more of this information. And we'll see you next time here on Creation Magazine Live.
And thanks so much for joining us.
It's been my pleasure.